New light is shining on TRC cases in South Africa. The National Prosecuting Authority said it had appointed a team of investigators and prosecutors to pursue reopened cases. The authority also picked former TRC Commissioner, Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza, as head of this team to review these cases for prosecution. Now, the NPA also said it had reopened 64 new cases. But what are these TRC cases? The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a court-like establishment that listened to and reviewed apartheid crimes. Cases that emanated from these hearings are referred to as the TRC cases. It could take the prosecuting authority up to 5 years to bring closure to some of these cases. The question then is, will time be on the side of justice? Thanks for choosing The Square today. I am Keminni Amanor. Joining us from South Africa via Zoom is Imtiaz Cajee. He's an author and nephew of Ahmed Timol, who was a victim of apartheid crime. Imtiaz, you're welcome to The Square.
Good afternoon, Keminni, and good afternoon, Nigeria.
Great. Now, you have said that the latest development from the NPA is welcome news, albeit a little too late. How so?
Look, Sister Keminni, South Africa had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 1996. And the objective of the commission was to get Apartheid-Era perpetrators and victims to come together. And that is why it was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, with emphasis on reconciliation. And the reality is that many Apartheid-Era perpetrators did not come forward and ask for forgiveness, reconcile with families so that families could get answers about what happened to their loved ones, and in that particular process, get some form of closure and healing, and that the country, with former Apartheid-Era operatives and the majority oppressed, moved together as a collective to set up a new nation, right? But the reality is that most of them did not come forward, which then meant that once the TRC final reports were handed over to the government of the day, the onus was on the government of the day to ensure that those perpetrators who failed to apply for amnesty be investigated and prosecuted accordingly. And that is the situation that the majority of South African families faced, that they waited for the National Prosecution Authority to investigate and prosecute these cases with the assistance of the South African Police Service at the time. And the reality is that only in 2017, Sister Keminni, the first case was reopened, which was the case of my uncle Ahmed Timol. And then in the last few years, a number of other cases have opened. The case of Dr. Neil Eckert, the case of Ernest Dipali, the case of Dr. Hussein Hafiji, and then last year, the case of Imam Abdullah Harun in the Western Cape. So for the very first time, there has been some progress after many, many years. And I think for me, the most important aspect is that finally, the National Prosecuting Authority has appointed a senior counsel, and I must emphasize an external senior counsel, to investigate the claims that were made since mid-2000 that there was political interference that hindered prosecutors from the National Prosecuting Authority from conducting its work. And these sentiments, Sister Keminni, were echoed again in 2019, when the murder accused in the Ahmed Timol matter, his legal counsel had 342A applications, and the full bench of the South Gauteng High Court ruled that their claims of political interference, of the rights of their clients being infringed in terms of the Constitution were not valid. And it was in 2019 where, again, senior prosecutors from the National Prosecuting Authority, Dr. Tory Pretorius and Chris McAdam, once again made the claim that political interference hindered them from doing their work. So the appointment of Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza is very important to review the work of the NPA to ensure that there is never political interference again. And secondly, to see that if there was political interference, those officials who were complicit of not doing their work be held accountable.
Very well. I want us to talk about that political interference. What exactly do we mean by that? How did that happen? Do you even know as a stakeholder in this?
Well, in 4 signed deposed affidavits, senior officials at the NPA claimed that the political leadership at that particular time, and we're referring specifically to the administration of President Thabo Mbeki, were directly implicated in discharging political pressure on the NPA that prevented them from investigating these cases. So what it resulted, Sister Kimmie, is that in 2005, 2006, when the National Prosecuting Authority looked at the case of my uncle, Ahmed Timol, for example, they closed the case saying that there was no evidence to pursue the case further. And this is exactly what happened to many, many other cases that the NPA looked at. They were simply closed to say that there's no evidence to pursue the cases further. But the former head of the National Prosecuting Authority at the time, Advocate Dumisa Ntsebeza, then deposes an affidavit where he claims that the Minister of Justice at the time, Minister Bridget Babanda, had interfered in the course of his duties. And in so doing, it had resulted in him unable to look into the case of post-TRC prosecutions, which simply then resulted in the TRC cases not moving at all. So that is the context of political interference.
And we know that over that period up until now, it's been the ANC in power, and the ANC is still in power as we speak. And it brings me to the concern of whether or not what we are seeing from the NPA right now is just not a storm in a teacup that will blow away after a while, or there could actually be closure for families like yours.
Look, I think we need to be fair in our criticism. The NPA, and history will judge the NPA since, and this ANC-led government, Sister Kimmie, from 2003, as to how they failed to ensure that post-TRC cases were prosecuted. But we must give the NPA credit in the last few years, under the directorship of the Deputy National Director of Public Prosecutions, Advocate Rodney de Kock, that they've put a team together. They've made a presentation to Parliament outlining an action plan to deal with these particular cases, to assist us as families to take the matters forward. We as families are engaging with the NPA so that our members have got direct access to the prosecutors from the National Prosecuting Authority, as well as the investigating officers from the Hawks, which is the police arm. And the reality is that we don't have a choice. I mean, many years have passed. Critical witnesses from the family sides have passed on. Those implicated from the Apartheid-Era regime have passed on. And we simply have got to work with the system that is presented to us currently, with all the challenges that is faced, because if we don't take this particular opportunity, you know, we're never going to see any progress regarding post-TRC prosecutions.
I want to talk about the struggle that families have gone through in seeking justice. You have been able to go through the court system, but for many others who have not been able to do that, but you're in touch with them. Talk to us about how the struggle has been for these families.
Look, I can tell you, I mean, I've basically, my entire life has revolved around the death of my late uncle. The early years to try and grasp what went on, to try and deal with the family that wouldn't speak about this painful past, you know, because they had accepted it and moved on. And this is unfortunately what many families have gone through post the TRs. And then I made it a project of mine that I'm not just going to speak about these matters. I published a book in 2005. I conducted investigations. I traced witnesses. And then I reached out to the Foundation for Human Rights, you know, who then came on board, put a team together to assist me. But the most important aspect is that I did not go to civil society and the Foundation for Human Rights with empty hands. I went literally with a docket. And I think this is what's inspiring for other families, that if I could accomplish this particular task and then get assistance from the Foundation for Human Rights, put pressure on the government of the day to get this matter open, then there is hope for them. And that is why I've made it a priority of my life since the inquest that was opened in 2017 and pursuing for the murder accused João Rodrigues to be held accountable, to continue working with other families, and now to work with the state to make sure that, these matters don't just get left open-ended. Because family members are dying, they've given up hope, they've got no intention, or they can't see any future. But now finally, there's some progress and there's a glimmer of hope. And for that, we must commend the NPA, and that is why we continue working with the NPA and put pressure on them that they move with speed to deal with these issues.
One of the things which you have alluded to is time, because both witnesses and the perpetrators are aging, and some of them have passed away. Like in your case, the police officer in question had died in 2021. Now, talk to us about how some of these missing blocks could affect the hearing of cases in the justice system.
Look, irrespective of how our emotions are and how sensitive we feel about these matters, Sister Kimmie, to take a matter to court, we need evidence. I mean, we need forensic evidence. Not just hearsay witnesses or newspaper reports. We need to reconstruct the crime scene. So in my uncle's matter, the police claimed that he had jumped from the notorious John Foster Square police station to his death in October 1971. With the assistance of forensic experts, the trajectory specialists, they reconstructed the crime scene. We were fortunate that we had a set of partial inquest records. We were fortunate that I had managed to identify and follow up with many witnesses, critical witnesses. And they all testified during the reopening of the inquest. But the reality is that these inquests cannot be reopened if we cannot reconstruct the crime scene, if we don't have forensic evidence, we don't have pathology reports, we don't have critical witnesses. They are all serious factors that need to be taken into consideration. But the reality is that we are putting pressure on the NPA, unlike mid-2000s where they simply just closed these cases, but to work with them to ensure that if in any particular case that the matter is closed, that they've explored all the avenues to try and retrieve as much evidence as possible.
Very well. I want to talk about the external advocates, Dumisa Ntsebeza. What exactly is his job over the next 3 months?
Look, very simply put, my understanding based on the press release issued is that he's got 3 specific taskings. The one is to ensure that the NPA have got checks and balances in place, that from now onwards, that there can never be any claims of or allegations of political interference from the executive or from any other authority, right? Then secondly, during the course of his review, he needs to make sure that if there were senior prosecutors at the NPA who failed to execute their duty, then he basically provides a report in that regard and hands it over to the National Director of Public Prosecutions to take further action. And I think this is the most important aspect pertaining to his particular mandate. So I think for the very first time, more than 2 decades after the final TSA reports were handed over, the issue of political interference will now be finally concluded. We will ascertain if there were prosecutors who failed to execute their duty. And more importantly, there are checks and balances in place to ensure that never again is there any interference from political parties, from the executive, from external entities, from civil society, from any entity to prevent the National Prosecution Authority from doing its work.
You have experienced the system around the TRC cases firsthand. What would you say are some of the checks and balances that could be employed to ensure that interferences are curtailed?
There's got to be absolute transparency. And I think the NPA is demonstrating this right now, that at least the first phase is that they are interacting directly with us as families, which never happened before. So if you look at the mid-2000s, Sister Kimmie, they just closed the cases. Now we are having regular meetings with them. We're having updates from them. So at least we're part of the process to see what progress is made pertaining to any particular investigation. And then there has to be systems and checks and balances within the National Prosecuting Authority, where the Deputy National Director of Public Prosecutions, the NDPP, and then the Justice Portfolio Committee, that they conduct proper oversight on these cases. Because the reality is that Parliament and the Portfolio Committee since 2003 will be judged by history for failing to ensure that post-TRC prosecutions were done timelessly.
Very well. Now, let's talk about one issue that you have raised before, the fact that apartheid documents are still classified. What developments have happened since 2 years ago when you lamented that issue? Has that changed?
It's a very critical matter that you are raising, because you can imagine, how do we reopen these matters when we don't have full access to all apartheid-era records? And the reality is very little or hardly anything has ever happened regarding declassifying apartheid-era records. And this, again, is an initiative and it's a project that must be driven, because it just doesn't make sense that for us to reopen inquest, to make findings, and we've got no guarantee that government departments under the ANC have made full disclosure of all apartheid-era records pertaining to that particular matter. And I think the trend internationally, Sister Kimmie, is that after 20 or 25 years, by default, these cases or records are declassified, and obviously taking security matters into consideration. But the reality in South Africa is this has been completely neglected. And I think this is long, long overdue. It must be confronted, because if it is not confronted, we find a situation where apartheid-era records will still be held back, unfortunately, by those who are working in government under an ANC-led government, ensuring that full disclosure and transparency is not provided.
So I just want to know, on a personal level, how did that affect your case?
Look, in my case, Mr. Kimmie, what happened was that the inquest was concluded in 2017 October, right? Judge Bill Motley made a historic finding that my uncle Ahmed Timol did not commit suicide, as ruled by Magistrate de Villiers in 1972, but that he was murdered in police detention, right? Then Judge Motley, in his judgment, recommended that further investigations be conducted against the 3 apartheid-era police officers. Murder accused João Rodrigues was obviously suspect number 1, and Neville Else and their sons, for perjury, for other detainees. And what then transpired was that for a period of, 3 years, his case continued to be postponed. His legal counsel took the matter to a full bench of the South Gauteng High Court, to the Supreme Court of Appeal in Bloemfontein, saying that their client was not getting a fair trial. And then in September 2021, Sister Kimmie, the murder accused João Rodrigues passed on. So his criminal trial never commenced. And then the apex court in the country, the Constitutional Court, dismissed the matter because of Rodrigues' passing. So there again, history will judge this government to ask, but why did you not ensure that this man's criminal trial commences? And this is where the issue of political interference comes in, because this is what his legal team argued, saying that there was a secret amnesty parallel to the TRC process, which meant that all apartheid operatives were given indemnity, were given amnesty, and they should not be charged. And we waited for the Constitutional Court to make a ruling in this matter. And this never happened because Rodrigues had passed on.
Well, and let's see what happens with Ntsebeza's work. But would you say that based on, obviously your case has brought new light to apartheid apartheid crimes and the TRC cases, because then you'd find the NPA quoting what the judge had said in your case, with checks and balances, and reassuring the public that they would ensure that things go as they should. But I'm just wondering, do you feel you ever got justice despite going through the system as you should have?
Again, you ask very, very pertinent questions. The reality is that if the matter was heard successfully at the TRC in 1996, Sister Kimmie, then it would have meant that all of those that were involved in my uncle's matter would have been subpoenaed in front of the TRC to come and give statements. And a proper investigation would have been conducted in 1996, because João Rodrigues, the murder accused, was not alone in my uncle's matter. So history will rule and judge that the TRC did not deal with the matter timelessly, because it was at that platform where we would have got to the bottom of what transpired. And all of those that were involved in my uncle's arrest, detention, his death, would have had to prepare and to depose statements and affidavits. Then in 2003, again, when I reached out to the National Prosecuting Authority to say, look, I already have sufficient evidence warranting further investigation, they shut the case down. So most certainly, truth and justice has not prevailed in my uncle's matter, but at the end of the day, with the efforts of my persistence and the assistance of the Foundation for Human Rights, we managed to get an inquest reopened, we managed to get an inquest finding reversed. So definitely it is welcome, it is progress, but most certainly, the systems and the checks and balances post-apartheid fail to ensure that we get to the bottom of what transpired.
Very well. When we come back, we'll chat a bit more about this latest development and then talk about the TRC for the sake of the international community. You're watching Village Square Africa. We'll be right back.
News Central TV, Africa's #1 storyteller, has come with the best of both worlds. With a combination of news app and live TV, we ensure that you keep track of the latest headlines, breaking news, and in-depth analysis from professional journalists from around the continent. Download the News Central TV app on Android and iOS and get started today. Don't forget to follow us on News Central's social media platforms. News Central, Africa First.
Welcome back to the square. Today our focus is on new light shining on TRC cases in South Africa. What is this new light we talk about? The National Prosecuting Authority in that country has appointed a team of investigators and prosecutors to review cases that came through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that looked at Apartheid-era crimes. And, well, it has been on ice for a bit, but now things could be changing. With us is Imtiaz Cajee. He's an author and nephew of Ahmed Timol. Now, Ahmed is a victim of Apartheid-era crime, and he's been sharing his perspective on these latest developments and a few other issues with us. Imtiaz, thank you so much for your patience. Prosecutions were not the only things that the TRC recommended, you know, at the time it wrapped up its work. Talk to us about some of the other things like reparations that were also recommended. What has happened to that?
Again, very, very pertinent question, Sister Kimmie. I mean, the TRC have made numerous recommendations, and obviously post-TRC prosecutions was just one of them because that directly affected me. But the issue of reparations, the issue of how do apartheid-era companies, you know, who had benefited during decades of oppression of the majority of people in this country, you know, how do they pay back to a new democratic South Africa? The TRC was basically setting up a blueprint, you know, of a new vision of a new South Africa. This is parallel to the Constitution of how the country should envisage the way forward, you know, for a future-looking South Africa to ensure that we never go back to the evil crimes of the racist apartheid regime. And the reality is that, again, there was a president's funds that was set up, you know, to deal with the issue of reparations. I know that many families received a once-off 30,000 rands during the TRC process. But parallel to that, there were other initiatives taken, you know, to provide educational support, educational assistance to families of loved ones, and so forth. And the reality is that, again, more than 2 decades later, if my memory serves me correctly, Sister Kimmie, there's a president's fund was more than R1 billion sitting in that fund, which is still not being distributed. And the challenge is, again, that more than 2 decades later, you know, you are going to find new challenges that are emerging. I mean, who was rightfully a victim, who was not a victim. And then, as always, I don't think in South Africa, but across the world, that when that amount of money is put in the public domain, without a systematic approach of dealing with these issues, you know, you are creating and raising additional chaos that will, that will unfold. But the reality is that these matters of the TRC were not timeously dealt with post-2003 when the final TRC reports were handed over. And the reality is that 2 decades later, families are left grappling with these issues. And, these matters just go on. But I need to be honest, Sister Keminni, that I'm more aligned to the issue of post-TRC prosecutions. Because on the issue of reparation, my late uncle was never married. He died at the age of 29. His parents have both passed on. So, it was never really an issue of financial reparation in my matter, in my uncle's matter. But this is not the same with many, many other families. Because in their cases, they lost breadwinners. They don't have homes. They don't have funds to send the children of our martyrs to school, to varsity, and so forth. So the issue of financial reparation is very critical in their cases.
Very well. Imtiaz, we've been joined by Ziad Kimmie. I'm sure you know Ziad very well. And, well, I'm told we lost Ziad again, but perhaps when you're here, great. Right, so Imtiaz, I'm sure you know Ziad, but for the sake of our viewers, Ziad Kimmie is Executive Director for Foundation for Human Rights. Ziad, you're welcome to the program. You have been doing you have been doing a great job with the families there. But talk to us about where the foundation sits on this latest development.
Yeah, I would echo Imtiaz in saying we welcome this development. I think perhaps the terms of reference are perhaps not as clear as we would have liked, but those things will be, I hope, sorted out in due course. The question of political interference, was there interference? And clearly the answer is yes. As Imtiaz pointed out, the cases that were handed over to the NPA from the TRC were not prosecuted. And the question of why they were not prosecuted is simple. Someone decided that these cases should not be prosecuted. On the one hand, I think Advocate Ntsebeza will be able to look at the internal processes within the NPA to the extent that if they were given political instructions, why those were followed and who was responsible. But I think there is a broader question about who gave those instructions and how those decisions were made that extends beyond the institution that was corrupted and that it affects the entire political system more broadly. The NPA was the target of the political interference, but the political interference happened at a level above the NPA, and I think we have called for an independent commission of inquiry to investigate the broader question of political interference, and we hope that that will come to pass.
Ziad, I apologize. You've missed quite a bit of the conversation with Imtiaz, and I'm going to have to rush you the last few minutes that we have because I want to go to Imtiaz back. You mentioned that the foundation would have liked a better terms of reference. What would you rather have in this case?
I think there are a couple of issues that Advocate Ntsebeza has to deal with. One is how effectively is the NPA prosecuting these apartheid-era cases now? And the question of political interference is to some extent been lifted. There's now, I think, a good faith effort to make sure that the cases that are on the table, for which there is sufficient evidence, are going to be prosecuted. But the bigger question is, does the NPA have the capability to effectively prosecute those cases? And if not, what do they need to put in place to prosecute those cases? And the evidence from the cases we've dealt with, there's a case of the COSAS 4, and there's a case of Nokadula Simalani. In both of those cases, the NPA's performance has been, to put it bluntly, inadequate. So there may be political will, there may be the structural reforms at the highest levels to say we must do these things. That's very different from the NPA actually having the on-the-ground capability to prosecute these cases. And in both of those instances, even with the inquests that happened, the Timol, the Haroon and the Hafiji inquests, if it hadn't been for independent counsel acting on behalf of the families, those inquests would not have proceeded as positively as they did. So the question here is not just a case of we've made a decision to prosecute. The question is now, do we have the systems and the capabilities in place so that we can actually get to the truth. And this is not...
And what do you think? Are those systems in place? What do you think?
No, clearly not. The evidence is clear. We can look at the case of Nokuthula Simelane, who disappeared and whose body has never been recovered. The NPA is a passive participant to the delaying tactics of the two accused who are on trial to the time. They're not doing their jobs effectively, they're not pursuing the case with sufficient vigor. And so we have delays after delays. And as with João Rodrigues, I think it's almost inevitable that the accused at some point will either be actually incapable of standing trial or will have died. And then the matter will then be swept away. So here's an opportunity where there's to have an actual prosecution where the NPA's capability is undermining its ability to prosecute effectively. So no, I don't think the capability exists within the NPA, and the answer is to find out why not, and to put in place the mechanisms so that we can have some actual progress, and not the half-hearted attempts that we've seen in a number of cases that are currently before the courts.
Well, if I'm a family of a victim and I'm listening right now, I'll probably lose hope. Especially if, on that score, that the authority may not be as effective in prosecuting a case that, you may have to reconstruct evidence in order to successfully prosecute. You won't say something, I want to hear.
But the answer is that, as with the initial, what we've advocated for a long time is that a specialized unit needs to be set up. You're dealing with crimes that have happened many years ago. You're dealing with a particular type of human rights violation. You need a specialist capability. It's akin to prosecuting financial crimes. You don't take a run-of-the-mill prosecutor and say, here's a complicated financial crime, don't prosecute it. You're setting yourself up for failure. So you need to have the specialized capability. And the NPA, to its credit, has started setting that up. The next step must be to say, can we now put in place additional measures to make sure that when you have a prosecutor on a case like Nokuthula Simelane, they are not just a run-of-the-mill prosecutor. They've got the training, they've got the capability, they've got the support to be able to deal with the type of cases they face. So it may be disheartening at first, but this is progress. How do we take the next step? It's not enough to say the NPA is now taking the cases seriously. Let's all rest on our laurels. Victory has been achieved. But certainly that's not true. But also, this is not a case where it's simply a position that's antagonistic to the authorities. Our aim here is to get justice. And to get justice, we need a justice system to perform effectively. So what can we do to support them? What suggestions can be made? And that is part of Advocate Ntsebeza's mission as well, to look at the current configuration and to say, how could we do these things better? How could we work more effectively?
Very well. So one of the things that families have said is they want transparency in this renewed process or renewed energy with the cases, something that Imtiaz has also reiterated. But as a foundation, how do you think that the NPA could rope the public in and ensure transparency?
I think we have to accept that with some of these large state institutions, there's a natural tendency to hide information, to obfuscate. And it's great that they are talking to the families and they're giving the families information because they are key stakeholders and they're important. But the South African public is also an important stakeholder. I think there has to be more transparency. It's not enough to say we're dealing with 120 or 60 cases. Which cases are you dealing with? Which prosecutors have been put in place? Who's leading these cases? So, the question is, on the one hand, of course, justice and closure for the families. But the broader question is about the rule of law and impunity. If people can get away with Apartheid-Era crimes, gross human rights violations, then we shouldn't be surprised that when the next set of crimes comes along, of a slightly different or lesser caliber, an arms deal or state capture, that we're going to see the process repeated. There's going to be, look the other way, let's not prosecute corruption, national unity, and this case will go away. And what we have is an erosion of the rule of law and a culture of impunity. So the NPA, it has a responsibility to the South African public at large to say more explicitly how it's dealing with these cases. It's not enough to give broad, vague details. And I understand, when you're dealing with prosecutions, there are questions of confidentiality. There are tactical and strategic questions. But I think the NPA can be more transparent about what it is doing and how it is doing it.
Well, hold on for me, Ziad. I just want to check if we still have Imtiaz over the connection. Imtiaz, are you there?
Sir, Kimmie.
Great. Now, when we look at all that has happened, and I'm asking both of you, Ziad, you too, from the outside looking into the Rainbow Nation, it would seem like a mess, despite all that the country has been through, as far as, getting over apartheid is concerned, if that's even the correct way to put it. Cases are still outstanding. There are many more that could not even make it to the point where we could say we want to prosecute. Is there true healing in the Rainbow Nation? Imtiaz?
Well, we've got to go back and look at the TRC. And we should not forget that the TRC came out of a political settlement where the former apartheid regime and the liberation movement led by the ANC came to a compromise. And that is what led the conflict in the country to an end. And it was on that basis that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was formed. And I think if you understand the dynamics of that particular time, you will clearly see that I am of the view that the TRC itself was a theater. It was a show where victims were given a platform to relive the traumatic time of losing loved ones. But the reality is that only a few Apartheid-era perpetrators were prosecuted. And that is why when they speak of commissions of inquiry, South Africa has got a history of commission of inquiries. We have the Sereti Commission, we have the Zondo Commission, where they spend millions of rands for prosecutors to perform in front of national and the nation. And the reality is nothing surfaces from those particular areas. So when we criticize, Sister Kimmie, we must be fair in our criticism. The reality is that the Foundation for Human Rights depends on foreign donors to help us as families to investigate and prosecute our cases. For the very first time after more than 2 decades, the state is taking responsibility. Most certainly it's not perfect. And if you want to look at the system, then you need to go back to the TRC. How was it that we allowed the TRC to get away with what they did? And the reality is now the state must take responsibility. And most certainly it's not perfect. It can never be perfect because for decades they've hidden TRC cases. They found excuses not to deal with it, even post the Timol inquest in 2017. And the reality is that the issue of truth and reconciliation issues have been relegated in this country.
Very well.
It's been put on the back burner, completely on the back burner. And now there's a momentum to bring these cases back to the table again. And that is why I personally, I'm not leaving it to the Foundation for Human Rights to represent me and continuously speak on my behalf. I commend them for the work that they've done. But we as families need to take our rightful place to ensure that we stand up and we speak on these particular matters because we are directly implicated. And we cannot make this another political affair between civil society and government. There is progress on the table with all the shortcomings that there are. But there is progress. We must refine those processes and move forward.
I apologize for interrupting, but if it's okay, let me just hear Ziad as we wrap up, because I have definitely run out of time now. Will there ever be true healing in South Africa regarding these cases?
I think that's an extremely difficult question. As Imtiaz has said, it's easy to look back and say they could and should have done particular things. But we shouldn't forget that we were potentially looking at a civil war with large-scale loss of life. And there were very serious attempts to start that civil war. And part of the Truth and Reconciliation process was that compromise, that
Right.
we avoided a civil war in order to let some people get away with what they did. And, I think it's very difficult to say the counterfactual, what would have happened had, we taken a different course. So I think we need to judge people on the basis of the conditions they faced.
Well,
and
3 months.
it was, perhaps, in my mind, a necessary compromise.
We have 3 months to make another giant step with Advocate Ntsebeza. We'll see how that goes. Gentlemen, I'm grateful for your time here on The Square. Imtiaz Cajee is an author, nephew of Ahmed Timol, who is a victim of apartheid crime. And then we also spoke with Foundation for Human Rights Executive Director Ziad, Kimmie. We'll stay on the story a bit longer in the future. But right now, that'll be all. We'll see you same time here on The Square tomorrow. My name is Keminni Amanor.